Hello, and welcome to Forward Together, where science, ethics, and religion intersect in a changing world. My name is Katie Hinman, and I am the Associate Director of the Dialogue on Science, Ethics, and Religion at the American Association for the Advancement of Science. I am delighted to welcome you to this symposium today. Through this virtual platform, we are able to gather from all over the country and the world. I want to gratefully acknowledge all of the diverse and vibrant Indigenous peoples on whose ancestral homelands many of us stand. I am joining you from Northeast Washington, D.C., which is the ancestral homeland of the Indigenous Piscataway and Nacotchtank Anacostan peoples. For those in North America, I encourage you to visit native-land.ca as a starting point to see what Indigenous communities call your region home and to learn more about them. Before we begin, there are a few logistical notes to help you navigate the program. After this plenary session, we will have 3 sets of concurrent breakout sessions, then our closing plenary, followed by a reception. You will join each of these sessions directly from the agenda at DoSER.events. So after entering the main event page, just click the Join Webinar button next to your desired session, and it will open a new Zoom window for that session. Each of these sessions are also being recorded and will be available on the DoSER.events page within a few days. Live closed captioning is also available for all sessions. You may turn it on and off using the closed caption button at the bottom of your screen, and you can also use that button to change the settings. And in all of the sessions, we'll be taking questions from the audience. So we invite you to use the Q&A button to ask questions throughout the sessions. You may also upvote others' questions. And while there are many advantages to online events, one of the things we miss the most is the chance to interact with other attendees. So in order to facilitate conversation, please visit our conference forum. There's a link at the top right of the DoSER.events page, as well as a little conversation balloon at the bottom right where you can pop it up in a new window. So clicking the login button on the forum will automatically log you in, and you can join the various conversation spaces. We invite you to use this forum to introduce yourself, share resources and upcoming events, chat with other participants. There are also conversation threads for each of the individual sessions. Now note, the moderators will not be monitoring these threads during the session, so please use the Q&A function on Zoom during sessions, but the forum can be used to share insights, ideas, and resources with your fellow participants. It will be active for the next month, so please feel free to continue to use it. And in addition, we hope you'll join us after the closing plenary for our networking reception. And again, you can join that directly from the event agenda at DoSER.events. This will be your chance to mix and mingle with other participants and speakers. And at the end of the event, we hope you will take our post-event survey, which is linked at the very bottom of the agenda page. We'd love to have your feedback on the program. If you have any technical issues during the event, you can email registration@goavex.com for assistance, and that link will be in the chat. So let me once again welcome you to our conference, where Forward Together, where science, ethics, and religion intersect in a changing world. As I said before, I'm Katie Hinman, and I'm the Associate Director of the Dialogue on Science, Ethics, and Religion here at the American Association for the Advancement of Science. The American Association for the Advancement of Science, or AAAS, is the world's largest general scientific society. It's the publisher of the Science family of journals, and in addition, AAAS has many amazing programs that help us fulfill our mission to advance science and serve society. One of these programs is the Dialogue on Science, Ethics, and Religion, or DoSER program, which facilitates communication and engagement between scientific and religious communities, recognizing that these often overlap. The DoSER's program's 25th anniversary was in 2020, and in celebration of this milestone, we are hosting this symposium to bring together some amazing folks who are working at the intersection of science, ethics, and religion. You'll hear more about the DoSER program in just a bit, but I do encourage you to check out our program website at AAAS.org/DoSER, and particularly our new resource website at sciencereligion.dialogue.org, where you can find videos, articles, and other resources. You can also find us on Facebook and Twitter. If you're live tweeting today, we'd love it if you tagged at AAAS_DoSER. And AAAS is a nonprofit organization. Programs like DoSER are funded through grants and private donations. So if you'd like to make a donation to support the work of DoSER, you can do so at AAAS.org/support-DoSER. Now, the intersection between science, ethics, and religion has a somewhat mixed history, with attitudes ranging from the assumption of insurmountable conflict between science and faith to the idea that religion and science just have no relation to each other and nothing to say to one another, to times when faith has motivated and supported scientists and scientific advancement. But there have always been those who have maintained that science, ethics, and religion all benefit when there is open dialogue and engagement between them. Most recently, of course, the COVID-19 pandemic has shown that science and religion intersect in very concrete ways, with scientific findings dictating the modes by which people worship, while religious leaders have had to become communicators and influencers of public health guidelines. But these interactions aren't limited to the field of public health, which is why in celebration of DoSER's 25th anniversary, we wanted to bring together speakers who are working at this intersection of science, ethics, and religion in a variety of fields to talk about how this dialogue is at play in their work and where they see engagement between science and faith being important in the future. To kick it all off, it's my honor to introduce Dr. Jennifer Wiseman. Dr. Wiseman has been the director of the Dialogue on Science, Ethics, and Religion at AAAS for 11 years. She is also a senior astrophysicist at NASA, where she studies the formation of stars and planetary systems. Dr. Wiseman is also interested in science policy and public engagement and served as a Congressional Science Fellow of the American Physical Society. She's a frequent public speaker, a former counselor of the American Astronomical Society, and a fellow of the American Scientific Affiliation. A little known fact is that she even co-discovered a comet. Welcome, Dr. Wiseman.
Thank you, Katie. It is just such a pleasure to be here and to commemorate the 25th anniversary. Of course, we're actually at 26 years of this Dialogue on Science, Ethics, and Religion program, which is really unique because we are an effort of a scientific society to engage with these communities that are thinking about broader issues, how science impacts the values and the applications of technology in our world today, and what the meaning and purpose behind all of this interaction can be. So let me just see if I can share my screen. There we go. Why does this dialogue matter? This dialogue between scientists and religious communities? Well, here are some headlines that have been in the news recently. Just some examples. The Vatican Space Observatory wants to see stars and faith align. How does science inform our understanding of who we are as human beings? How about faith in the COVID-19 vaccine? In this story about using the Black church to get the word out. Or here's one: scuba diving rabbi adopts the ocean as his part of the world to repair. And then indigenous Alaskans, through their faith and worldview, are demanding a voice in what's going on in climate change research. Islamic leaders battling misconceptions about vaccines and related religious practices. So these are just some examples from the headlines where we know that science and technology interrelate with all aspects of our lives these days, and our lives are also shaped by the values that come from worldviews, and worldviews are often based on religious faith or informed by faith and values from religious communities. As Katie said, the AAAS supports the advancement of science and serving society, and the DoSER program is one of those programs. It was recognized 26 years ago that if scientists are really going to be effective at serving society, with science, we need to recognize that religious faith is an important part of most people's worldview and their identity. And this is how scientists can better enable science to serve society by being better able to interact with faith communities. So we have several projects in the DoSER program. One of the main things we do are public events, which you'll see if you check our website. We have seminars at scientific society meetings. We have a public holiday lecture every December. But we also have longer term projects where we actually bring scientists into longer term interaction with faith communities. One of them is our Science for Seminaries project, very successful for quite a few years now, helping seminaries who want to incorporate science into the education of future clergy, because clergy then become influential in the lives of many, many people in the public sphere. And many times these religious leaders would like to be better equipped to talk about science and to encourage good conversations about science and technology in their congregations. So helping that be a part of their seminary training is what this project is all about. And one of the participants in the seminary says that he often meets people who share a passion for faith and science and who say, hey, I thought I was the only one who had this passion about how these can be in communication. And then he says, we imagine this field is rife with conflict, when the truth is that we are just not very well networked. We have another project called Engaging Scientists in the Science and Religion Dialogue. This is an effort to help the many scientists within AAAS and beyond who come to us and say, you know, I really like this idea of scientists having more constructive interactions with faith communities, but I don't really know how to do that. Or I don't quite understand where the people of faith in my classroom are coming from and their questions about science. So we've been holding workshops at scientific society meetings and at research university campuses on invitation over the last few years. And these have been very well received, helping scientists. And the scientists come from many perspectives. Sometimes they are people of faith, sometimes they don't have a personal sense of religious faith, but they're very interested in having a better interaction between scientists and the many diverse faith communities in our nation, in our world. Dr. Salman Hamid, one of the scientists who's been a participant in this program, said that I know from personal experience how outreach by a scientist can change lives. Having that kind of impact is incredible. And I would like to point out that our program is building on the idea that it's relationships that are the key to moving forward in this kind of work. It's not just the philosophical ideas of whether science and religion can be in harmony with one another. Lots of people think deeply and well about that topic, but we're about building connections between scientists and faith communities. And often those connections take place in the realm of ethics. How can we ethically use the science and technology that is advancing so quickly? I want to tell you a little bit of my own story. I love space. I love all nature. I grew up in a rural part of the country and on a farm, and I loved looking up at the sky and wondering if I could be a part of that space exploration enterprise. I grew up in a family of faith, and you know, it was very much in harmony to think that studying the natural world would be in sync with understanding the world from the values of faith. And then I found out that many other people share that same hunger to bring all of these kinds of values together in their lives. So there's some images of the beautiful countryside where I grew up, experiencing the beauty of nature, loving animals, observing them all. And then I had the chance to become a scientist. And in astronomy, I have studied how stars are continuing to form. The vibrancy of the universe inspires me and brings me to awe every day. And along the way, I discovered that people are hungering to hear about this, including people in faith communities. They really want to know what's going on in science, how the advances in science can inspire us, can uplift our spirits, can enrich even concepts of faith, but also how science and technology can be used to serve people around the world. I know that was the way I felt and have felt my whole life. And I take great pleasure in helping connect scientists with faith communities where we talk to each other about what's happening in science and how the interests of faith communities can inform scientists as well about how we can best use the scientific advances that we are making. So I'll close with Dr. Adelman's quote here. She's a professor of psychology. She said, "Scientists and people of faith speak a common language, which is awe and wonder about the world at large. Let's meet on common ground and consider our common interest." And I think that's a beautiful statement. We have awe, we have wonder, and we have a desire to serve people and creatures around the planet. And I think together, scientists and faith communities can make science be as effective as it possibly can be in helping make our world a better place. I want to mention that we have some wonderful donors who've helped and continue to support the work of the DoSER program over the years, including the John Templeton Foundation, the Sloan Foundation, the Carpenter Foundation, private generous donors like Leslie Sternlieb. We have partnering organizations such as Sinai and Synapses, and many others. And I just want to give my heartfelt thanks to these people and organizations. So to exemplify this conversation of how scientists can positively interact with faith communities. And by the way, we've discovered it's about people and relationships. And you don't actually have to share the beliefs of the faith community that you're interacting with, or vice versa. If you're a person of faith, you don't necessarily have to agree with all the philosophies of a particular scientist. But even in these different worldviews and perspectives, we've discovered that building these relationships and bringing people together is what is the most helpful in the science and religion interface. And so in this respect, we have a wonderful example of a person doing just that. And I'd like to introduce Dr. Nalini Nadkarni. Dr. Nadkarni is a professor of biology at the University of Utah. She studies ecological interactions in rainforest canopies with support from the National Science Foundation. And she shares her knowledge through collaborations with faith-based groups, artists, corporations, and the incarcerated. Her work is featured in many journals, including Science, and in public media like Science Friday and Wait, Wait, Don't Tell Me. Her awards include a Guggenheim Fellowship, the AAAS Award for Public Engagement, the William Wilson Award for Advancement in Social Justice, and the Archie Carr Medal for Conservation. And she's participated in several of our DoSER panels and events. She exemplifies a scientist reaching out to interact with faith communities and find common ground. So Dr. Nadkarni, I'd like to welcome you to our symposium today, and we're looking forward to hearing what you have to say. And then I'm looking forward to having a conversation with you, facilitated by Dr. Hinman as well. So welcome.
Great. Thank you so much, Jennifer. That was an excellent description of the big picture of why we interact, why scientists and people in faith interact. And kind of as a counterpoint to that big picture, I'd like to describe why and how I, as an individual scientist, have engaged faith-based groups with trees and forests. I love being a university scientist who communicates with other scientists, but I also want to directly protect nature by raising awareness of the many values of trees among many kinds of people. And these groups that I've interacted with include urban youth, corporations, the incarcerated, and faith-based groups. And I chose to engage faith-based groups because nearly 85% of all humans self-identify as being religious, which is a much larger proportion than those who are scientists or conservationists. And in addition, I have a lifelong commitment to protecting trees. I'll share my screen here. As a kid, I loved climbing trees, and I swore a solemn oath to protect them when I became a grown-up. Also, my dad was from India. He was raised as a Hindu. My mother was of Russian parentage, and she was raised as an Orthodox Jew. And my parents really taught me that the essence of all religions are the same, that religions need not be divisive, but they can be overlapping and even complementary. And so why do I use trees as a connection between these two groups? Well, first, trees are my own area of study. I've carried out basic research on forest canopies for over 35 years, funded by the National Science Foundation. And so I understand their ecological values, sequestering carbon, providing habitat for very diverse biota. And a second reason is that trees are wonderful ambassadors to nature. Trees hold values in many sectors other than science. They have spiritual values, aesthetic values, economic and medicinal values. Thirdly, another reason is because trees and forests are now threatened by human activities like climate change and deforestation. And with increasing urbanization, people have grown more and more distant from trees and forests. So I'd like to describe my approach to working with faith-based groups. My premise is that people will take care of and protect what they value, whether it's sports cars or an engagement ring or an old growth forest. So I figured that if we can articulate the values of trees that resonate with people who might not be aware of or care about the ecological values of trees, we might be successful in gaining support for the protection of trees because of these other values that they hold. And so to engage with faith-based groups, I wanted to avoid the potential conflict that I saw between science and religion. And so I drew upon the philosophical premise of intellectual humility. That is, I would temporarily lay aside my own way of knowing science to understand the values of others. And I modified this slightly to frame this as what I call the humility for others' perspectives through engagement, or what I call hope. And so I really flipped the traditional approach of scientists' interactions with faith-based groups. Instead of asking them to learn about scientific processes by drawing on scientific authorities, I learned about religious values of trees by drawing on the religious authorities. That is, I read the holy scriptures of world religions and identified references that had to do with trees and forests from the Bible, the Quran, the Talmud, and the Book of Mormon. For example, when I downloaded the Old Testament and did a search for the words trees and forests, I found there were 328 references to those two words. And I categorized them as a scientist. Of course, I had to categorize them into symbolic and aesthetic use, analogies to life and God, practical use, location descriptions, tree loss is bad, and tree biology, all very positive aspects of trees. I also learned about the holidays and rituals associated with trees. I learned that the Jews have a wonderful holiday called Tu B'Shavat, which celebrates the new year for trees with a special meal. Buddha found enlightenment underneath the Bo tree. Muslims look for the form of the word Allah in the shapes of tree branches. And in the Book of Mormon, I learned about this tree with white fruits that represents God's love for his followers. I also decided to familiarize myself with religious venues by visiting churches and other places of worship for several months. I observed that sermons are given and received with emotion. Congregants listen attentively to sermons. There's music in churches. There's a place for contributions. And people were very friendly to me in the after-service coffee hour, even though I wasn't part of their faith. So from this information, I prepared and delivered a sermon called Trees and Spirituality from the pulpits and bimas of over 40 places of worship in many denominations of religion. I extended this to mapping trees that grow on the sacred ground of churchyards and created pamphlets with information about the biology of those species and the scriptures that relate to those species, which we then distributed to the congregants. Last year, I also engaged the Mormon Tabernacle Choir to interact with my scientific society, the Ecological Society of America. After a year of negotiating with the president of the choir, he agreed that the choir would sing songs about nature when our annual meeting came to Salt Lake City. And in that way, ecologists could literally listen to what the members of this faith celebrate about nature, which is really exactly what ecologists do as well. Another way that we're planning to interact post-pandemic is to use the extensive land that churches and seminaries own to engage congregants with ecological monitoring via citizen science projects like Project Budburst. Now, for pretty much all of these activities, I've worked by myself or with a few other students, but recently I have connected with DoSER to participate in university workshops and to speak at seminaries to clergy in training. And that seminary work actually has led to a meeting that I'm going to have next week with the Archbishop of Canterbury to discuss aspects of environmental justice. And he is the spiritual leader of 85 million Anglicans and Episcopalians, a very broad reach. What did I learn? I have many things to learn, but what I've learned so far is that both scientists and people of faith are very curious people. Both want to answer important questions about who we are, how did we originate, where did the universe start, and how should we behave with each other. I've learned that many religious people are not closed-minded. Many religious people care a lot about nature. Many scientists are religious. And I learned that I don't have to be religious myself. I just have to respect and to listen deeply to others to usefully interact. Some of the benefits that I've gained have been first, to be part of a larger sphere of people who can trustfully engage about the values of trees and nature. And I think that trust might spread to other scientists and other scientific issues, for example, public health and vaccinations. Secondly, I think that many scientists are interested in social and environmental justice, but don't have access to those particular groups, whereas many churches carry out works that bring them in contact with the poor or the war-torn or those subject to disasters. So those contexts can be very useful for ecologists and scientists as well. Third, I found great beauty in the language of the Holy Scriptures. The metaphorical connection between humans and nature really can't be better said than the words of the 23rd Psalm. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He restoreth my soul. And lastly, a benefit that was somewhat unexpected and actually quite personal arose, and that was finding solace in my own hard times. I had a life-threatening accident about 6 years ago, and when I was in the hospital, I found myself seeking out the hospital chaplain to discuss and gain guidance about the fears that I was experiencing at that time. In terms of the benefits that I think I might have conferred, I think that faith-based groups witness that scientists want to share answers that we have found with others and want to listen to the answers of others as well. And so by approaching these other worlds outside of our own, I think we can collectively find common ground, as Jennifer said, and we will find common ground as we continue. And from that common ground, I think we'll be able to share our science, our religious beliefs, our ways of knowing, our worldviews in new and vital ways, with the result of better understanding and better caring for our Earth. So that's what I have found, Jennifer, and I'm eager to talk to you about all of this.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nadkarni. And I'll ask Dr. Wiseman to go ahead and turn her camera and microphone back on.
Okay, I just a technical note. I'm getting a message that says unable to start video because the host has stopped it. Oh, okay.
There we go. My fault. Sorry about that. I do want to mention, while Dr. Wiseman is rejoining us with video, that Dr. Nadkarni's work has been featured in a profile series that DoSER has produced called Profiles in Science Engagement with Religious Communities. And we'll put the link to that in the chat because you will definitely want to read her profile as well as those of others who are approaching this work in a variety of ways. So I'm delighted to have a chance to talk with both of you, Dr. Wiseman and Dr. Nadkarni. You've given me permission to use your first names for this conversation. I appreciate that. And I want to thank you so much for your presentations. One of the things that that really came out in both of your presentations are these ideas of shared values, of common language. Jennifer, you mentioned that quote about the common language of awe and wonder. Nalini, you talked about this commonality of curiosity. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about where you see that coming through both in your own life, and also if there are other common values that you see coming through in this work between science and religion.
Well, I'll kick it off, but I really want to hear what Nalini has to say. So, but I think all of us, we have shared humanity. Everyone wants their children to grow up in a safe and clean environment. Everyone wants to understand how they can use technology in ways that are helpful to their lives. And I would say, as an astronomer myself, I think almost everyone is interested in where we come from and how we fit into the larger universe. I find it interesting that in this role and in a personal role as well, I often get invitations to speak in different kinds of congregations. And, it doesn't matter from what religious tradition the congregation is from, and it doesn't even matter where they are on the spectrum of what we might call conservative to liberal and progressive. Everyone asks me the same question: do you think there might be life beyond Earth? And we're finding all these exoplanets, and how this is really cool. What are they like? A curiosity. And so I think science does bring shared values of curiosity, and I hope a little humility as we look around at the natural world and the universe around us. And then I think shared values of wanting to use in practical ways what we learn from science and technology to help the world and to help others. At least I hope that's the case, and it's been my experience. But I'd like to hear what Nalini has to say.
Sure. I think that's a great question, Katie, because what I've been struck with over and over when I've gone into churches or interacted with seminaries is this, and I'll speak from my own lens of caring for the earth and nature and ecology. I realized that I had made assumptions, that I had assumed that because, church-going people might believe that the world was created in 7 days, and so they might not believe in the same kinds of things I do in terms of how all this biodiversity evolved. I made the assumption that church-going people would not have that consciousness somehow. And so I was at a Baptist church giving one of my sermons on trees and spirituality. And I was approached by a congregant who said, "Dr. Nadkarni, could I get your email address, please?" And I said, well, I thought, okay, here it comes. He's going to try to turn me into a Baptist. And I explained to him I was a Hindu Jew, and, I went to a Unitarian Sunday school for a couple of years, but that's about it in terms of Christianity. And so I said, it's really not worth it trying to proselytize me. And he said, "Oh, no, I wasn't going to proselytize you. I was going to invite you to a tree planting that our church is holding next Sunday, because I thought maybe you and your students would be interested in helping with that, in helping to protect God's creation." And I was so taken aback and so angry at myself for having made the assumption that he was going to shove his world on me or his worldview on me, that if I hadn't given him a chance just to speak for a couple more sentences, I would have made that terrible mistake. So I think one of the things about finding, approaching, and nurturing common ground comes with it the necessity to lay aside not only our own perspectives, but our own assumptions. And when we do that, I think we have a greater chance of finding that common ground, the common language, perhaps not common belief, but as Jennifer has pointed out several times, it's not important or necessary to do that, at least in the cases that I've experienced, that it's this finding, exchange, and interacting over that common ground that provides this pleasurable, wonderful, awesome, really set of interactions that leads perhaps to other kinds of interactions as well.
Well, and that's interesting. One of the other things that you brought up was this necessity for intellectual humility. And I would think that both scientific communities and religious communities would hold intellectual humility as a value. We would like to believe that we demonstrate intellectual humility in understanding that there's always a little more for us to learn. I think the challenge is sometimes showing intellectual humility across fields. We might be somewhat humble in our own field, but still make those assumptions. So I wonder if you can talk a little bit about, have you approached any of this from that kind of scientific standpoint of like, I mean, I noticed you did very much do the data collection on your reading of the
Yes.
Old Testament, but where you've had to kind of challenge yourself, I guess, in that way.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I mean, I do tend to take an intellectual and scientific approach in trying to understand anything, whether it's, the distribution of quotes about trees in a Bible, or whether it's my own forest ecological work in Costa Rica. But so sometimes I feel that's a perfectly fine way to orient and accommodate understanding of another world. And it certainly worked in my case in terms of analyzing the scriptures. But I think one of the things that I've learned is that, and have taken a great deal of pleasure in, has been to consciously suspend that in order to better understand. And I'll give you an example of that. I was invited to give a talk at the Wartburg Theological Seminary in Iowa. This was in the early days of COVID, and the conference that they had, and was about creation care, from this Lutheran seminary, quite conservative in terms of their religious beliefs, invited me to talk about trees as part of this. And this was COVID. We were just getting used to virtual conferences, and they had set this up so that there was a chapel session to open the conference, which is very typical, I think, of many religious conferences and so forth. So all of the students were in their dorm rooms. I was, of course, in my office and so forth. And there was this moment where the screen went dark and everybody was brought in virtually to the chapel, and everybody recited the Lord's Prayer. And I knew the Lord's Prayer because I used to have to say it when I was in elementary school. And I found myself so moved by hearing these voices of people who had been isolated for months. And this was the first time they were sort of connecting in that way. And I had been invited to connect in that way. And I myself started murmuring the Lord's Prayer myself. And I felt the collective power and connection of that with this religious community. And I felt very grateful to be involved with it. And it made me feel a part of it, even though I wasn't a part of it. And I think that was a kind of an example of how one can feel included in a religious ceremony, a religious activity, not feel intimidated or excluded, but be a part of it, and yet not having to be a part of it. It's hard to describe, but it was a very inclusive feeling, and I'll never forget that. It was a very powerful moment for me.
Well, so for both of you, I think one of the things that kind of points to is, I think sometimes the assumption is, well, there's obviously a benefit to religious communities for scientists to engage with them. They'll get this scientific knowledge and things like that. There isn't always necessarily this idea of a benefit for the scientist or the scientific community. So can you talk a little bit about either generally or in your own work? I know, Nalini, you've talked about some of these kind of personal benefits that you've received. Jennifer, I don't know if you have something like that to share, or something that kind of speaks to this on a larger level.
Sure. Well, I think one of the things we've heard time and time again in the history of this DoSER program is that religious communities really don't appreciate being thought of as people who need remedial education in science. So this is not what the dialogue on science, ethics, and religion is about. This is a two-way dialogue. And then scientists likewise are like, well, wait a minute, I don't really want to be evangelized by religious people. I can, I either have my own faith or I don't need a faith. So this is where misunderstanding begins. But what we've discovered is that, in fact, there's a huge, vibrant reward for having dialogue and interaction between these overlapping communities of scientists and faith. And what is it that scientists benefit from this? Well, they learn how science actually impacts people's lives. I think it helps scientists frame the kind of sometimes very focused and tedious research that we sometimes do in the bigger picture of why this is important and why it matters to people, why people would want to support the scientific enterprise. And so that helps scientists, I think, get grounded into what science and technology are for, the kinds of questions that people are interested in, be it the big philosophical questions like where did we come from and how do we relate to the rest of the universe, to the very practical questions of, how do we get vaccinations successfully and safely transmitted around the world when there's many barriers of poverty and politics and all kinds of things. So I think scientists gain a lot by talking to faith communities to understand the context of science and the values that people hold that shape their view of how to use and embrace science and technology. And likewise, faith communities benefit hearing from scientists, not just to learn about what's going on in science, which I think is incredibly important because science is changing all the time, but also to understand better how they can improve their own ministries by having good scientific input. Many faith communities, as Nalini mentioned, are involved in a very hands-on work, serving the poor around the world, helping with education, helping with food and nutrition, helping with healthcare, really as part of their ministry. And that can be done better if faith communities understand cutting edge knowledge of science and technology in all of these fields and can apply it in a practical way. So there's all kinds of benefits in both directions. And another thing I think we've quickly learned is that used to, when you throw out the phrase science and religion, everyone would kind of think, oh, this is an argument about evolution versus, how long did creation take? And surely there's still a lot of interesting questions about how life began and has evolved, and these kinds of things are interesting to discuss. But there are so many other topics that faith communities are also interested in: genetics, neuroscience, space exploration, environmental stewardship, artificial intelligence, healthcare, you name it. We're going to be talking about a lot of them this afternoon in the symposium. And I think that's something we've learned as well.
Mm-hmm.
Nalini, do you have other thoughts?
Said. Well said. Yeah. Terrifically said. And I would say that this is not just, the mindset of a couple of fringe people in AAAS or, like weirdos like me. It's look at National Science Foundation. Many of us scientists get our funding in basic research from the National Science Foundation, and National Science Foundation has two criteria upon which they base their funding decisions. One is intellectual merit of pushing forward your own field, but a second one is broader impacts or research impacts. And you have to have both of those in every single proposal. So NSF, in its wisdom, I think has seen and is manifested this idea that scientists must not only push forward their own narrow fields and to further advance intellectual merit, but scientists also have to think about what are the broader impacts, and certainly engaging with and learning from faith-based communities is a very valid way of carrying out your broader impacts requirements. So I think there's kind of evidence, so to speak, from the structure of these proposals and the structures of the National Science Foundation and other scientific agencies that promote this idea not only of intellectual merit and science on its own, but the value and the necessity for scientists to participate in broader impacts or research impacts.
We will be taking questions from the audience. I see that people are putting questions in the Q&A. And as we prepare for that, Nalini, I wonder if you could talk just a little bit, if other scientists are interested in getting involved with this work, do you have some practical tips for actually how to do that?
Yeah, sure. I would say, first of all, do it. Whatever it is that you want to do in this area, please go ahead and try whatever you'd like to do in terms of linking together science and faith-based groups. I would say that one of the difficult parts for me was actually getting into churches for the first time, because I'm not of that faith. There are not many Hindu Jewish places that you can go if you're a Hindu Jew. And so as it turned out, I started knocking on doors of churches and synagogues and inviting myself, saying, I'm a scientist, but I'm really interested in this, and didn't really get anywhere until I contacted a personal friend of mine who happened to be training for the ministry in our local Unitarian church. She made an introduction to the minister. I was then brought in. They saw that I was not trying to proselytize science. I was trying to learn. And once I gave that one sermon, I was then passed along to other Unitarian churches churches, and then Presbyterians and Methodists and Catholics and Jews started becoming aware of the fact that I was deemed as okay by that first church. So don't hesitate to draw upon your neighbor who might be an Episcopalian, or talk to the person across the street who, in my case here in Utah, might be a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. That you don't have to just rely on institutions or DoSER, or, I mean, that can help, but you can also use your personal context as well. I think starting small is a really great way to do. I mean, some of the stuff that Jennifer talked about with these large scale programs are just so amazing and so fantastic, but starting small, like as I did with, one little Unitarian church, which led to another, is a perfectly good way to go. You can have deep impact on a small number of people. And in fact, I've done the math on this. It turns out there are 325 million people in the US, 6.2 million scientists. If each scientist talked to just 52 people a year, that's one person a week, we will have talked to every single person in the United States. So that could be your barista talking about shade-grown coffee, or your Uber driver talking about astrophysics, whatever. But I think that we often think we have to make a big impact by going big in terms of numbers, but actually I think that we can go small. So I would say those are the two big tips that I have from my own experience. Go ahead and use your personal contacts to make these connections, and don't be afraid to start small.
We had a question for the audience. Do either of you have examples of faith communities kind of actively seeking out science and scientists to work with them on issues of that they care about?
Well, I certainly do. So faith communities, I have found, are very interested in science. They sometimes have trouble just pulling in kind of mainstream secular scientific discussions into their congregational environment, because it doesn't have exactly the same framing as they talk about things in their faith community. But if you visit or are invited as a guest into a faith congregation, I found that you don't have to talk about religion, or try to pretend like you're part of that community if you're not. They're really interested in learning about you, your own story. What's your own story, even if it's a different story than that of the people that you're talking with. And then they want to hear about your science, what you do know about, and I have found that to be something very welcomed and very interesting. And faith communities are hungry to hear from scientists and learn about what's going on in the world of science and technology and how it impacts the quality of life in their own ministry. And likewise, I've met a lot of scientists who say, I'd really like to interact with faith communities, but I have no idea how to do that. That's what we're talking about right now. And one thing we've learned with DoSER, we did a project a few years ago called the Perceptions Project. And it was really designed to get at kind of underlying perceptions that religious communities and scientists have about each other, whether they're right or wrong, as a first step. But part of that project was something very profound. We went to 6 different cities, and in those cities, we invited pastors of churches and science leaders from the local research university to spend a day and a half together. And we weren't trying to hash out particular issues where science and religion might interface or even have some conflict. We were just having people get to know each other and talk about what's on their minds, especially in the realm of science. And we spent, as part of that, maybe a half an hour bringing the scientists into the environment of a faith community, maybe a church or a seminary, just to hear from some leaders there and look around. And we took the whole group, including scientists and faith leaders, to a laboratory at a local university for like a half an hour, just to look around the lab and see what scientists really do, hear from people and students at the bench. And they all said this was completely life-changing, that this just upended their whole worldview, just that tiny little interaction, interpersonal, and in going in each other's space a little bit without an agenda. And so I think if we could all create a few more opportunities like that, it would be wonderful. Religious congregations inviting scientists to come visit, or even to recognize that you probably already have scientists or people in science related fields in your congregation already. Ask them to speak about what they do. And then for scientists, make some friends and contacts with people of faith. They're all around you, including in your university, in your neighborhood, in your kids' sports groups, in your book reading club, in your gym, and find out what goes on there, and maybe even be adventurous like Nalini and visit some of these congregations. And I think that's a first step. The interpersonal touch is what's often the hardest, but the most impactful.
That is super well said, Jennifer. That's great. I'll just add one small thing to that I have found out sort of later in my progression of working with faith-based groups. And that is, when you ask Katie, do people approach you? Do people approach us and invite us? I would say that very often, church groups don't know about us. But one of the things I've been doing more recently is to publishing this work in theological journals that are read by people of faith, and especially leaders of faith. And so this is from a journal called Currents in Theology and Mission. And it came out of that seminary thing I talked about where they said the Lord's Prayer. And so I was invited to contribute to their journal, and that has resulted in acknowledgements and invitations from people of that faith because they read it in their own places. So it's just like if we were to find something in the journal Science, about religion, that would be kind of interesting and different, but it would mean scientists would have access to it. So I think we have to think carefully about how do we disseminate this. And it may not even be a religious journal. I mean, you can go to your university office for media and communication and talk to one of the journalists there and say, I went and talked to a church, or I joined a tree planting that belonged to a church. That makes a little bit of news, makes a little bit of awareness that scientists are actually doing that. And since it hasn't been done all that much, just the fact that you're doing that actually turns into news. And so why not put it into a place where university people will read it, and perhaps people in the outer community. So dissemination of what we do is something super important in terms of building that intersectoral community, I think that Jennifer and you have been so instrumental in establishing.
Well, we have a lot of great questions coming up in the Q&A, but we are pretty much out of time. I am going to ask you one and ask you to answer it quickly, but I think it's important. One of the issues with dialogue, right, is it goes both ways. So how have your beliefs and opinions changed as a result of your engagement in the science religion dialogue? And just very quickly.
I'll pass that to Nalini.
I think I would have to say I still don't believe in God in a way that perhaps a more standard traditional religion person would, but I have much more curiosity, and I feel I have much more access, and I feel I can converse and interact and provide an interchange far better, with far more effectiveness than I could before I started doing this. So it hasn't shaken me in terms of faith itself, but it has affected me in terms of the way I view the world, in the way I view religion, in the way I view religious people and their connection to science.
I would just quickly say that I have found that scientific curiosity, far from bringing divisiveness, as we often hear about in public culture, but it actually draws people together, this kind of common sense of curiosity and awe and wanting to use science and technology in very good ways. And so I have found that unifying effect of science to be quite profound and inspiring for me. And if we had time, I would ask you, Katie, about your own experience, because little known to the audience, but Dr. Hinman herself is as an ecologist, a scientist studying bats, and is a United Methodist pastor, so has had some of these interactions. So if you have a word to say, we'd love to hear it, Katie.
Well, I will leave that. I'm going to do a plug, actually, for encouraging folks to take part in our conference forum on the website. We will post the questions that came up in the Q&A in the forum as well, so folks can have conversation about that. And Jennifer and Nalini, I hope you'll drop by and stuff so that this conversation can continue. Unfortunately, now we're out of time, but thank you so much, Dr. Wiseman and Dr. Nadkarni, for that inspiring kickoff to today's events. Just as a reminder to participants, we now have our series of concurrent breakout sessions. So to join the next session, just click the button next to the session of your choice on DoSER.events. That will open a new Zoom webinar for your sessions. So thank you again for joining us for this event, and we'll see everybody back together for our closing plenary.
All right. Thank you.
Bye.